Suffering from dry, tired, irritated eyes? Don't let dry eyes win. Use Sustain Pro. It hydrates, restores, and protects dry eyes for up to 12 hours. Sustain Pro. Triple action dry eye relief.
Need a laptop that's built to perform and designed to last all day? Select Windows 11 PCs starting at $499.99 are now at Best Buy. Learn more at bestbuy.com. Best Buy. Imagine that.
Want to elevate your travel experience? Here's how. With a Delta SkyMiles Reserve American Express card, you can relax before your flight in the Delta Sky Club with up to 15 visits per medallion year. And now through July 15th, 2026, you can earn up to 125,000 bonus miles, so you're closer to your next adventure. The Delta SkyMiles Reserve card. Check out the new design at www.delta.com/Spotify. Minimum spending requirements and terms apply.
Welcome to the Murder Diaries. I'm Natalie.
And I'm Paige. Make sure if you want to listen ad-free, you head over to patreon.com/murderdiariespod. And you can also catch us on YouTube now.
On May 24th, 2004, Oakey Kite missed work without notifying anyone at the office, something he'd never done before. Known as Al by everyone he knew, he was punctual to a fault. When coworkers and police went to his Aurora, Colorado townhome to check in on him, what they found was like something out of a horror movie. Al had been brutally beaten and tortured, and the killer had nearly decapitated him with one final fatal slash of his throat. Was this some random thrill kill? Or was this crime tied to something more calculated and sinister? More importantly, who would want to do this to a person as friendly and well-liked as Al Kite? This is his story.
Used to think it's in my head, but I'm walking with the dead.
Before Al Kite became the victim at the center of one of Colorado's most perplexing unsolved murders, he was simply known as Al. Oakey Al Kite Jr. was born on May 7th, 1951 in Nash County, North Carolina. He grew up in the small town of Weldon alongside his sister Barbara, raised by his father, Oakey Albert Kite Sr., a respected dog trainer, and his mother, Edith Davis Kite. When Al was 18 years old, he experienced a loss that would stay with him for the rest of his life. His mother died while he was still a young man. Like many people from small towns, Al built his life through hard work and determination. After graduating from Weldon High School, he earned a Bachelor of Business Administration degree from Atlantic Christian College in Wilson, North Carolina. As an adult, Al created a successful career that would take him far from the place where he grew up. In 1976, he married Gail Kay, who had a daughter from a previous marriage named Julie. Although Al and Gail eventually divorced in 1988, his relationship with Julie never changed. Friends and family said he loved her as if she were his own daughter, and the two remained close long after the marriage ended. Professionally, Al spent decades working for the engineering services company Stone & Webster. The job kept him traveling throughout the United States, and over the years he worked his way up to become the head of his department. His reputation as a skilled accountant and dedicated employee eventually opened the door to a new opportunity with a consulting firm in the Denver area. By the spring of 2004, Al was living in Aurora, Colorado, just outside of Denver. At 53 years old, life seemed to be moving in a positive direction. He enjoyed simple pleasures, golfing, camping, spending time outdoors. He had recently started dating a woman named Linda, and by all accounts, both were excited about where the relationship might lead. After more than 30 years in accounting, Al was respected by his colleagues and admired for his work ethic. He lived in a 2-story townhome on South Helena Street, occupying the upper level and renting out the lower level for extra income. But when people talk about Al today, they rarely start with his career. Instead, they remember the kind of person he was. The descriptions are remarkably consistent. Al was friendly, funny, the type of person who could strike up a conversation with anyone. He loved to laugh, loved to tell jokes, and always seemed to have a smile on his face. He wasn't someone people feared for. He wasn't someone who lived a dangerous lifestyle. He was, by all accounts, a genuinely kind man living an ordinary life, which is exactly what makes what happened next so difficult to understand.
On Monday, May 24th, 2004, Al failed to show up to work at Carter Douglas. Because of his reputation as an extremely punctual employee, it didn't take long before his colleagues began to worry that something was wrong. The colleagues went to his home on South Helena Street, and when they got there, his blue and gray 1983 GMC Sierra pickup truck wasn't there. And also, nobody came to the door when they knocked. His colleagues also spoke with some of his neighbors while they were there, and they discovered that Al hadn't been seen since Saturday, May 22nd. Still feeling like something might be wrong, the colleagues called in for a welfare check. But when police arrived to do said welfare check, they found that the door was locked, the garage door was also locked, and the windows were securely shut. There was no sign of any forced entry, so the police had to force themselves inside Al's home. As they headed upstairs, everything looked normal. Al was known to be neat, and nothing seemed to be out of place. The odd thing that police noticed, though, was that the kitchen sink had been filled with bleach. Sitting in that bleach were various kitchen knives, a drinking glass, a set of keys, and a knife sharpening rod. From there, the police went downstairs to the finished basement, which had a living room, a bedroom, and a bathroom. Things looked normal in the living room, but it was in the basement bedroom where police were met with a horrific scene. Al was found inside that bedroom, and there was blood everywhere. It coated the floors, the walls, and even the ceiling. It was clear that Al had been murdered and that he'd been dead for at least one day. When he was found, he was fully clothed, lying face down on the floor with his feet slightly under the bed frame. His head and upper torso were covered with a small blue bath mat. As police removed the bath mat, it became clear how brutally Al had been attacked. His face was bruised and covered with injuries that extended down to his neck and shoulders. He had a large laceration on the back of his head, and his throat had been cut so deeply that he was almost decapitated. It was clear to police that Al had been tied up and tortured extensively before he died. No bindings were present, but marks were left behind on Al's body. Those marks told police that Al's hands had been elaborately tied to his ankles with rope. Those marks also led police to believe that he'd been bound around the upper arms above the elbow and twice around the knees. The rope had been tied multiple times in different cross patterns, and police estimated that at least 40 feet of rope had been used to bind Al. The bottom of Al's feet were exposed, and both were covered in wounds and bruises. Bruises across his body suggested that he'd been beaten with multiple blunt objects. An autopsy later revealed that Al had been stabbed a total of 11 times, above the eyeballs, into his eardrum, down through his shoulders, and across his upper torso. The autopsy also established that all of the bruises and stab wounds, besides the one that slashed across his neck, had occurred before Al died. Now, it's not always on the murder diaries that we will go into such detail, but this is important when it comes to this uncovered case because it shows just how awful of violence Al endured. Given that, it was pretty clear that this crime was either executed by some kind of sadistic psychopath who was into torture and murder for their own gratification, or the torture was a calculated way for someone to extract information they wanted from Al before killing him.
As investigators worked their way through Al Kite's townhome, one thing became clear almost immediately. The violence had been contained to a single area of the house. Whoever killed Al had done so in the downstairs basement bedroom, and that detail mattered. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere in the home, leading detectives to believe that Al likely knew the person who entered his house that day, or at the very least, felt comfortable enough to let them inside. And because there were no indications of a struggle on the main floor, investigators theorized that Al had gone downstairs voluntarily. In fact, they considered the possibility that Al and his killer may have had a reason to be in the basement together. Perhaps they were discussing business. Perhaps the person had come to view the rental space. Whatever brought them downstairs, police believed Al likely walked there under his own power. But once investigators reached the basement bedroom, The scene told a much darker story. It was obvious that whoever committed the crime had been methodical. The killer had taken great care to contain the violence to that room. There was no obvious blood elsewhere in the home. And after the murder, someone had gone to the extraordinary lengths to erase their presence. The bindings used on Al had been removed. The knives used to stab him had been submerged in bleach. Surfaces throughout the crime scene had been wiped down. And perhaps most chilling of all, investigators determined that the killer had actually taken a shower before leaving the house. It was the behavior of someone who wasn't panicking, someone who had time, and someone who was thinking about what evidence they might be leaving behind. And what the killer chose to take was just as puzzling. Missing from the home were the bindings, the bottle of bleach, the towel used after the shower, one of Al's shirts, a pair of his pants, his wallet, his cell phone, and his truck. Investigators would spend more than a week processing the scene, searching for anything that might identify the person responsible. Then they found a break. On the carpeted staircase leading down to the basement apartment, investigators discovered a single drop of blood. It might not sound like much, but it was significant. Aside from that tiny drop, there was no blood anywhere outside the basement bedroom. Detectives believed that it may have belonged to the killer. The sample was collected and entered into CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database. If the profile matched someone already in the system, investigators could have their suspect. But no match ever came. Then there was another piece of evidence that caught investigators' attention. A small piece of rope found near Al's body. Police found no indication that the rope belonged to Al, leading them to believe it had likely been brought into the home by the killer and accidentally left behind. Meanwhile, detectives expanded their search beyond the townhome itself. They soon located Al's truck parked just a few blocks away from his residence. Inside, investigators recovered several strands of medium brown hair. The hairs were collected as evidence, but few details about them have ever been publicly released. Al's cell phone was eventually found abandoned in a payphone booth at a Safeway grocery store in Denver. Unfortunately, investigators were unable to recover any evidence from the phone that helped identify his killer. Then came another clue. Police discovered that Al's debit card had been used at a Wells Fargo ATM at 9:59 p.m. on May 22, 2004. When investigators reviewed the surveillance footage, they found an image of someone withdrawing money from Al's account. The person was wearing a ski mask and gloves, making identification almost impossible. But detectives could tell a few things. Firstly, the individual was driving Al's truck. Secondly, they knew Al's PIN number. And thirdly, they successfully withdrew $1,000 from his account. The timestamp on the ATM footage also provided investigators with something else, a timeline. If someone was using Al's debit card at 9:59 p.m. that night, investigators believed it was likely that Al had already been murdered by then. And for the first time, they had a clearer picture of when his final hours may have come to an end.
Look, if there is one thing about me, it's that I hate waiting. Hold music, triggering. If it was a person, they would definitely be blocked. Earnin, on the other hand, would not be blocked. Earnin is an app, not a bank, that allows you to get up to $150 a day, up to $1,000 between paychecks. Tips are optional, and standard transfers take just 1 to 2 business days with no mandatory fees. Expedited transfers start at $3.99 and cap at $5.99. 5 million people are already using Earnin. Time just feels different when you're not waiting around to make moves. Getting paid twice doesn't make money scarce. It just feels that way. And with Earnin, it doesn't have to be like that. If you think about it, it is kind of odd that we have to wait to get the money that we've already earned, even though we live in a world where everything is instant access now. I don't know. Now that I've thought about it, I cannot unthink it. Download Earnin on the App Store or Google Play. It's spelled like earning money without the G. type in the murder diaries under podcast when you sign up. It will really help our show. Earnin is a financial technology company, not a bank. Access limits are based on your earnings and risk factors. Standard cash outs take 1 to 2 business days with no mandatory fees. Expedited transfers available for a fee. Tips are voluntary and don't affect the service. Available in select states. Terms and restrictions apply. Visit earnin.com for full details. To establish a more accurate timeline, investigators conducted interviews with people who knew Al the best. They learned from these interviews that nobody had seen or heard from Al since after 3:30 p.m. on May 22nd. That morning, Al had taken his girlfriend Linda to the airport. After that airport run, he met up with his best friend Mike in Denver, where the two were working on a remodeling project. At one point throughout that day, Al and Linda spoke on the phone during a layover in her trip, and everything seemed normal. He was upbeat like he normally was. By about 2 to 3 p.m., Al and Mike wrapped up their work for the day, and the plan was for each of them to go home, clean up, and then meet up later that night for dinner, but Mike never heard from Al again. Linda, however, did hear from Al again. She called him at 3:30 p.m. when she arrived at her destination. Linda noticed something during that call was off, though. She said that Al was quiet, which was completely out of character for him, at least in their relationship. After that phone call, she never heard from him again. His neighbors reported seeing him earlier that day, but nothing after that. Nobody reported hearing or seeing anything suspicious, even though the townhomes shared walls. One neighbor said that the walls were well insulated, so it wouldn't be unusual not to hear anything. Investigators tested this theory out by sending one detective down into the basement bedroom where he screamed as loud as he could. Another detective stationed themselves in the neighboring townhome on the other side of the wall, and yet another detective stood outside. Neither of them heard the other detective screaming from the basement. This makes us wonder, did the killer get lucky with this location of the murder, or did they have prior knowledge of how well insulated the basement bedroom's walls were?
During interviews with Al's friends and family, they were asked if they knew of anyone who would want to hurt Al, and every single person answered with a resounding no. Al was well liked, and by all accounts, a genuinely nice person. His torture and murder didn't make sense to anyone who knew him. However, there was one person who had a slightly differing opinion, and that person was Al's girlfriend, Linda. She told police that if they were to look at anyone, it should be the roommate that shared Al's home with him. Since his divorce, Al had occasionally rented out the basement of his townhome to supplement his income. A few weeks before his murder, Al had placed an ad in the newspaper and online, advertising the vacant basement apartment. A man from the East Coast responded to the ad saying that he would be moving to Denver soon to take a job with Wells Fargo Bank. So Al set up a time for the man to come look at the basement. By chance, Linda stopped by Al's home during the time of the appointment, and Al told her that he was showing the basement to the man and told her to come down and meet him. But Linda went upstairs first to use the bathroom, and by the time she went down to the basement, the man was gone. Al told her that the man said he wasn't interested in the basement anymore and left. But on May 18th, the man came back and told Al he changed his mind about the basement apartment. He signed the rental agreement, paid Al half of the month's rent payment, along with a security deposit, which totaled to $1,000 even. Al also gave the man a key to the townhome, the same key that would later be found submerged in bleach in the kitchen sink. But the man never moved in. He'd told Al that he'd had some furniture that might not fit down the stairs, and it was something the man said he needed to figure out before beginning the moving process. At the time of his murder, Linda still hadn't seen this new roommate's face because he'd never spent a night in the home. She'd only heard about him through Al. But there was a neighbor who might have seen this person, and that neighbor reported seeing a man with a cane walking into Al's townhouse several days before the murder. This person had dark hair, was well-dressed, and appeared to be in his early 50s.
Investigators were able to find the rental agreement that this person signed. It was crumpled up in a garbage pail inside the home. The name on the rental agreement? Robert Cooper. Also in the trash can was another piece of paper on which Al had written the name Robert and a phone number. When investigators looked into this Robert Cooper, they found that it was a fake name. In fact, every piece of information that Robert Cooper had provided Al was false. His social security number, that belonged to a woman in Indiana. The address, that was for an elementary school in Denver. And when investigators called the phone number that Robert Cooper had given as a reference, it rang to a retirement village in nearby Aurora. Detectives then shifted their focus to the phone number that Robert had given Al as his direct contact information. This number belonged to a burner phone that had been purchased in 2004 at a convenience store that was about half an hour away from where Al lived. Investigators were able to ascertain that Robert Cooper waited 31 days after buying the phone before activating it. This just so happens to be 1 day longer than the store where he bought the phone kept surveillance footage. After 30 days, the system reset and began keeping the next 30 days worth of footage. This ensured that Robert Cooper, or whoever this was, wouldn't be seen on the store's surveillance footage. While police didn't have an image of this person, they still had the burner phone number, which gave them a little something to go on. When they ran the number, records revealed that Cooper had used the phone more than 100 times to contact people who were renting out properties in the Denver area. Based on that information, investigators thought it looked like Cooper was hunting for a victim. A large number of the people Cooper contacted were in some way or another connected to the University of Colorado Hospital. They noticed another pattern in how when Cooper made his calls, all of them happened outside of normal working hours, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., Monday through Friday. He made his calls from different locations, too. This makes detectives think that Cooper did this so he wouldn't be pinned down to one particular location. All of this pointed to the preparation that Cooper had put in. He did his research. He knew when the convenience store would erase their footage. He also knew that police could trace cell phone calls. Now, back in 2004, this wasn't exactly widely known. So again, he had clearly done some of his research. More investigation into the burner phone revealed that all of the 100-odd phone calls that Cooper had made, he'd only met with 3 of those people in person. One of those people he did meet with in person was a professor of Romanian studies at the University of Denver. She told detectives that when she met up with him at her property, the hair on the back of her neck stood up. She said that Cooper made some inappropriate sexual remarks while she was showing him her house, and then he left. She also gave detectives a description of Robert Cooper, and it matched the description given by Al's neighbor. She noticed that Robert had a Romanian accent, and when she asked him if he was Romanian, he said that yes, he was. Investigators thought that clearly this was too large of a coincidence that Robert was Romanian and happened to be meeting with a teacher of Romanian studies. It's likely that Cooper used his accent to disarm the professor. Other witnesses who met with Robert Cooper gave different descriptions of him. One of them said that he believed Cooper was in his 30s, which conflicted with other witnesses that thought Cooper was 50-something. Because of this, investigators hold that Robert Cooper may have been altering his appearance from meeting to meeting. This way, it would be difficult for anyone to give a consistent description of him. Yet another example of how deceptive Robert Cooper was, altering his appearance so that it would lead investigators to nowhere. Detectives weren't deterred, though. They worked with all of the witnesses to create multiple composite sketches. Unfortunately, those composites would lead to nowhere, and the case would eventually go cold.
Ultimately, Al Kite's murder case would hit a dead end. Despite witness accounts and evidence gathered in the weeks and months after Al's murder, authorities were unable to find Robert Cooper. In 2017, investigators would reopen the case and turn to new technology with hopes of generating leads. They worked with Parabon Nanolabs out of Virginia, a company that specialized in DNA phenotyping. It's this process by which law enforcement uses ancestry to predict physical appearance of the person the DNA belongs to. Now, in this particular case, Parabon was able to use the DNA sample to create a snapshot profile which included predictions of skin color, eye color, hair color, and other physical traits. The profile they got from the DNA sample from Al's case suggested the suspect was of Southeast European descent, with fair skin, brown or hazel eyes, brown or black hair, and a few freckles. Since the DNA sample was 13 years old at the time Parabon created the profile, they created an age-progressed version that would reflect what he would look like in 2017. But unfortunately, the composites yielded no leads.
2 years later, in 2019, Paul Holes covered Al's case on his true crime series, The DNA of Murder. Along with another analyst, Paul looked closer at the binding and torture elements of the case. They noticed that a form of foot beating called falaka might have been used on Al. Falaka is a torture device used in Turkey to extract information from people. In this tactic, a cane or switch is used, but the knife sharpening rod found in the sink could be comparable to those kinds of tools used in the falaka method. The way that Al was tied is, quote, very specifically linked to a militant organization in Turkey known as the Turkish Hezbollah. While the organization broke apart in the early 2000s, investigators began to consider whether or not Robert Cooper might have belonged to the Turkish Hezbollah at some point. Paul Holes had the blood drop evidence sent off and analyzed again for ancestry. The results suggested that the person the blood belonged to could have a lineage traced to parts of Turkey. So all roads are leading back to Turkey. Had Robert Cooper been a part of the Turkish Hezbollah and then immigrated to America? Was he finding new ways to carry out torture since he could no longer do it with this form of militant group in Turkey? Authorities have never really been able to rule any of that out. On that same episode of DNA of Murder, Al's best friend Mike was interviewed, and he told Paul Holes that the afternoon of Al's murder, before he and Al parted ways, he remembered Al saying that he was going to go home and clean up and then meet with his roommate shortly thereafter. Just one more thing that points to Robert Cooper as the person who's potentially carried out the torture and murder of Al. Also, this same year, 2019, the Aurora Police Department submitted the blood evidence for genetic genealogy testing. The results were provided to the FBI, who began the process of working out possible family trees in hopes of identifying who Robert Cooper is. They were unable to identify anybody specifically, but they continue to try to build out a family tree as more and more people submit DNA to these ancestry companies.
As it stands now, there are currently no updates for Al's case. The killer remains at large, and authorities continue to search for Robert Cooper. This case has been covered by many true crime shows and podcasts throughout the years. And Derek Lavoisier, the host of true crime podcast and YouTube show Detective Perspective, has outlined some theories he has about Al's case on a recent episode. The first theory is the Paul Holes theory from the DNA of Murder, that the killer was a part of the Turkish Hezbollah group at some point and continued to torture and kill people in the U.S. because he had a taste for it and enjoyed it. The next theory is that Al's killer could have been a serial killer, a kind of transient who travels the country from town to town looking for his next victim. This person may have a fetish with torture, and they may even have a fascination with or be a fan of the Turkish Hezbollah, and may have participated or studied the various torture techniques used with that group. A third theory is that Al's killer is someone that had a personal vendetta against Al. It could be someone who prepared and executed a revenge plot against him for something specific that he may have done in the past. And it might not be something specific to Al. Could the killer have been someone linked to Al's girlfriend, Linda? Did she have someone in her past, maybe a secret admirer or stalker type who sought revenge against Al because he was dating her? The possibilities for this theory are endless. This is probably the most far-fetched of the theories, most likely because authorities have already vetted certain people who were connected to Al. If there had been something like this lurking in the background, surely investigators would have found it by now. Now, the final theory, Derek Lavoisier's theory, is when you think about the crime and the person who committed it, the killer was a person who was calculated, methodical, strategic, prepared, professional. What if Al's murder was made to look like it had been random, but Al had been the target all along? What if Al had known something or had been linked to information tied to something that made him a liability for someone else? Maybe something incriminating. And so this person or people hired a professional to come in, get close to Al, torture, and extract whatever information was necessary to be extracted from him, and then kill him. It's the stuff of espionage and mystery movies. But it's a real possibility if Al had been involved in something deeper. If you or someone you know have information about Al's case, call the Metropolitan Denver Crime Stoppers at 720-913-7867 or your local FBI office. There's a $2,000 reward for information that leads to the arrest of Al Kite's murder.
Make sure to follow us on all of our socials at the Murder Diaries Pod. We'll be back next week with coverage of another true crime case that needs your attention. Before that, you can find us on Monday with our Tragic Hollywood segment and Tuesdays with our DocuFiles segment. You don't want to miss either of those. In the meantime, make sure to subscribe on YouTube, follow us wherever you're listening, and until then,
stay safe.
Bye.
Look, if there is one thing about me, it's that I hate waiting. Hold music, triggering. If it was a person, they would definitely be blocked. Earnin, on the other hand, would not be blocked. Earnin is an app, not a bank, that allows you to get up to $150 a day, up to $1,000 between paychecks. Tips are optional, and standard transfers take just 1 to 2 business days with no mandatory fees. Expedited transfers start at $3.99 and cap at $5.99. 5 million people are already using Earnin. Time just feels different when you're not waiting around to make moves. Getting paid twice doesn't make money scarce. It just feels that way. And with Earnin, it doesn't have to be like that. If you think about it, it is kind of odd that we have to wait to get the money that we've already earned, even though we live in a world where everything is instant access now. I don't know. Now that I've thought about it, I cannot unthink it. Download Earnin on the App Store or Google Play. It's spelled like earning money without the G. Type in the Murder Diaries under podcast when you sign up. It will really help our show. Earnin is a financial technology company, not a bank. Access limits are based on your earnings and risk factors. Standard cash outs take 1 to 2 business days with no mandatory fees. Expedited transfers available for a fee. Tips are voluntary and don't affect the service. Available in select states. Terms and restrictions apply. Visit earnin.com for full details.